Good evening. My name is Brett Gustafson. I teach anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm also a member of NACLA's editorial board and a longtime student of Bolivia. Thank you for joining us for this panel titled Una nueva crisis, the legacy of the MAS and the future of Bolivia. I'd like to start by thanking the panelists, Linda Farthing and Pablo Solon. I will introduce them in more detail shortly. I'd also like to thank NACLA and the New York University Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for hosting this event. Also would like to thank from CLACS, Joana Morales, Omar Alejandro Dahuacre, Melissa Redondo, and David Pastor of NACLA for helping with the logistical arrangements. And finally, Pamela Caglia and Nikki Fabricant were the organizers behind this panel, and I thank them for inviting me to moderate. As many observers know, Bolivia is indeed in a difficult situation. With 10 days until the elections, the country continues to reel from the impact of the November 19 coup that led to the resignation of Evo Morales, the installation of a transition government that has overseen the killing of civilian protesters. We've seen the crushing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and an insufficient government response. And as we speak, there are rising levels of violence that appear to aim at creating an atmosphere of instability and insecurity in the lead up to the elections. There has been much debate and polemic over these events and how they are represented, and certainly we may hear some of that tonight. There's also much debate over what the future might hold. I am sure that our panelists will be discussing these questions in depth, so I will say no more and we'll get started. The purpose is not to have a debate or an argument, but to have a conversation, conversatorio, about the achievements of the past 14 years, as well as about some of the problems and limits of the process of change. We also hope to discuss the current moment and highlight some of the critical areas of policy that a new government will take up. We do not know who that government will be right now, but whether the MAS returns or one of the opposition parties takes the presidency, there will be intense contests over agro-industry, the natural gas question, the lithium question, and a social and ecological crisis of various forms. The format for this evening is 3 rounds of questions. I'll start each round by asking the question and give each panelist 2 or 3 minutes to respond, and then hopefully they will enter into conversation, and as necessary, I will add prompts as needed. With the 3 rounds, we'll go for about 45 minutes, after which we will open it up to questions from the audience. Those of you who are in the audience can go ahead and ask questions down in the Q&A section. We have people who are keeping track of that and will feed the questions to me later as when that moment arises. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce to you Linda Farthing. Linda Farthing is a journalist and independent scholar who has been doing research in Bolivia for several decades now. She's field produced 3 films. She's written for The Guardian, for Al Jazeera, The Nation, and The Economist. She's written numerous policy reports, authored 3 books on Bolivia, and is now working on a 4th book on the legacy of the MAS and the overthrow of Evo Morales last November. Linda, thank you for being here. And also, it's an honor to have with us Pablo Solon. Pablo Solon is a social and environmental activist, also a former ambassador for the plurinational state of Bolivia to the United Nations between 2009 and 2011. During his time as ambassador to the United Nations, Pablo spearheaded successful resolutions on the human right to water, International Mother Earth Day, harmony with nature, and the rights of indigenous peoples. He was also the chief negotiator on climate change for Bolivia and helped organize the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth, which took place in April of 2010. Currently, Pablo is was the executive director of Focus on the Global South in Asia and is currently the director of Fundación Solon in Bolivia, and he's here from La Paz. Pablo, thank you for joining us tonight. So we will jump right in with the first round of questions, or the first question. And we're going to start with Pablo here. What were the main achievements of the government of Evo Morales and the MAS? And what were the main limitations from your perspective? Pablo?
Well, thank you very much, Fred, Linda, and I'm very glad to be in this discussion. Well, I was part of the government and part of the process of change that we say started in the end of the 90s. Because even though the government of Evo Morales starts in 2006, in reality, the government is just the continuation of a process of struggle against neoliberalism, against privatization. It's a process of emancipation of indigenous peoples. You know? So for me, the most important thing to look at is that the process of the government of MAS reinforce the autonomy, the empowerment, the strength of social movements or not. And I think this is the key, because if you have strong social movements after a government, then you're in a better situation. And if after 14 years of government, you have weaker social movements with less capacity of self-government, with less proposals, something has went wrong. And this is, for me, is the key point of departure, because I must say something went very wrong in the case of Bolivia, because we ended 14 years later with social movements that were divided, controlled by the state, less independent, with less proposals, very much waiting to receive something from the state. And this is something that we, as part of the movement of the left, have to think, what happened? What happened with this process? And I think that is the key question. And I have asked for me for 10 years, what happened? Because of course the government of Evo Morales did good things. If you look at the economy, we had the nationalization of not only the gas, but other sectors of the economy. We had a bigger distribution of wealth with a bonus to social movements, to the people, to the population. Of course, we had a new constitution. We had, I would say, indigenous people were more confident in themselves because it was the first time that they were in the government, and this was very important. And this process that started with a lot of conflicts and problems between 2006 and 2009 suddenly began to change. And we began to see what I say, it's a process of degeneration. It's not a process of limitation, it's degeneration. The process of change into its contrary, for me. Why do I say that? And when do I see this started? When the government decided to make an agreement with the big agribusiness in order to continue in power and to stay in power. So we started as a government that was against GMOs, and we have it in our constitution. But then in the year 2010, this was allowed. And because why? Because the agribusiness wanted it. Now we have 100% of soy is GMO. And then we had the biggest problem. We were a government that promoted the rights of Mother Earth. And then we had a big conflict in the year 2011 in the case of Tipnis, where there was repression to one part of the indigenous people of the lowlands. And for me, that was critical. Because when a government of the left does actions of repression against indigenous people, that shows that something is going very bad. And I would say the government was captured, and Evo Morales and the team, by the logic of power. They began to do things in order to stay in power. And one of the things was, for example, okay, we're going to change the constitution that we agree. And we cannot do that. Our constitution was very clear. You can only be in the government for 2 terms. So there was no way to get out of this. And they forced a referendum in the year 2015, and they lost the referendum. And then suddenly there was a strategy to, well, okay, how do we overcome what the referendum has said? And all of these actions gave more arguments to right-wing forces to emerge. Right-wing forces could not have emerged back in Bolivia if from the government there would have not been this policy to try to do whatever they can in order to stay in the government. So I don't have enough time, but I just want to leave with a question. Why is it? Because I think what happened in Bolivia is not only Bolivia. The left in all the countries that I know has done the same mistake. And we have to reflect on our own mistakes because I think what happened last year was because of this process of degeneration. And we cannot say, oh, it's the right-wing forces that did it and we are just victims. No, we were responsible of what happened.
Thank you, Pablo. And I definitely have some follow-ups, but I'll turn it over to Linda to respond to the same question.
Okay, well, of course, I agree with almost everything that Pablo said, but I'm going to give perhaps a different kind of summary of that particular story. So, I mean, by any measure, given Bolivia's history, what the MAS has achieved is remarkable in policy terms. They increased Bolivia's share of natural gas revenues, which they then used to fund social programs and infrastructure investment, which along with increases in the minimum wage substantially reduced poverty and inequality. They brought unprecedented stability and economic growth to South America's poorest and most chronically unstable country. And even though they made every effort to control the process, they facilitated the birth of a new constitution considered one of the world's most radical. This constitution expanded civil rights and inclusion for indigenous peoples, including adopting the most progressive indigenous autonomy measures in the hemisphere. Women achieved legislative parity, making the Bolivian legislature one of the most equal in the world. The MAS government distributed more land to peasant farmers than had taken place since the 1953 agrarian reform. And its coca policy is the world's first harm reduction supply-side drug control model. But the MAS failed to transform underlying economic and political structures. While it significantly reduced income inequality, it was done by bringing the bottom up, meaning that life for the wealthy changed very little. In fact, thanks to extractivist expansion, particularly in soy agriculture in the East, and government contracts for schools and roads, the wealthy did very well under the MAS. The MAS failure to reform income tax, in my opinion, squandered an opportunity to diversify government income, which is now almost all from hydrocarbons and minerals, and to further reduce inequality in the society. The absence of any substantial effort to reform how politics is done, despite MAS rhetoric that it is a movement and not a party, and about decolonizing the state, meant the public administration and social movement organizations remained personalist and steeped in patronage. However, continuing and in fact expanding extractivism perpetuated the legacy of environmental destruction that has plagued Bolivia for over 500 years. This has fallen most heavily on indigenous peoples in the eastern part of the country, where prior consultation on extractive projects on their lands has largely been a joke. The MAS also made strategic errors in marginalizing, dividing, and co-opting Bolivia's often unruly social movements. Despite rhetoric that Morales would rule by obeying and lead a government of social movements, particularly after 2009 and 2010, even these discursive flourishes were abandoned. Not only did the government move further away from any influence from the grassroots, when the right wing struck in November 2019 and seized power, these movements no longer had the organizational strength to defend what, despite all its limitations, was the best government they had ever had. And I think that Pablo's questions about why this happened and a recognition that it didn't simply happen because of an extremely nasty right wing, but happened because of errors that the MAS made and inabilities or blind spots that the MAS had, I think is something that really needs to be thought through and fleshed out, because I think that it has echoes all around the world.
We have a couple of minutes before moving on to the second round. You both said that the relationship with social movements led to the loss of autonomy and the weakening of those movements. And conversely, and paradoxically, the government sort of made a détente with agro-industry, made many concessions to agro-industry. And you've suggested that this was a mistake, but was this simply a political calculation? I mean, Evo still had significant popular support. It was still winning elections. Why were these concessions made to agro-industry, and why were social movements weakened when, in fact, the movement had basically dismantled the Cruceño, the Cruceño efforts and had significant power? Why did they make this political calculation and this sort of concession to the agro-industry?
What do you think, Pablo?
If I may?
Yeah, go for it.
I think it's a process. Well, from 2006 to 2009, there was a big confrontation with the big agribusiness. And we had a big conflict, especially with the bourgeoisie from Santa Cruz. But then came this idea from in one part of the government, led mainly by Álvaro García Linera, but also Evo Morales was part of it, that the best thing we can do is give the right-wing forces in Santa Cruz something so that they will be quiet. So we will only persecute those that politically are against that, but economically, they will be happy. And you can see it, as Linda has said, they made big business. They had everything during the past 10 years. But to do this was to go against what we said we were going to fight. We said we were going to do a deep agrarian reform, a revolution, an agrarian revolution, that we were going to expropriate big landowners, and this has never happened. That we were going to reduce GMOs, that we were not going to produce agrofuels, that we were against mega dams, and so on. And why? I think because from the moment we won the 2/3 in the Congress, where the moment was our great victory and our great defeat. Because then the government tried to control everything. And you had 2/3 in the parliament. Even until now, it has 2/3 in the parliament. So you could control the judicial power, you can control what we call the Contraloría that looks for business, you could control everything, the electoral court, you even can control the human rights defender. And this was terrible. And suddenly, there was no more space for open speech. I mean, if you were criticizing the government, you would be marginalized. And you will be put aside. So this was a huge problem. It's very contradictory. And I think that is not only a mistake of the policy, it reflects also that we have a new bourgeoisie that has emerged during the mass. It's not only a political mistake. You have a bourgeoisie from what we call the contrabandistas. You have a bourgeoisie that has come out from the coca producers. You have a bourgeoisie linked to sectors of narco-traffic that have power. You have a bourgeoisie of companies that have got money from contracts with a lot of cases of corruption. So suddenly this bourgeoisie, it's a new bourgeoisie, it's not the old bourgeoisie, wanted to stay, but the government was reflecting more the sectors of these new elites than the needs of and the visions and the demands of popular sectors and social organizations.
That makes that makes a lot of sense. Linda, do you want to add anything briefly?
Yeah, I just want to say that the strategy of the MAS seemed to be at some point in terms of the Santa Cruz elite, which are very powerful. I mean, Santa Cruz is economically and now in some sense politically the strongest place in the country. There's been a real shift away from La Paz, is that the decision was to divide the economic and political elites, I think. And they managed to do that very effectively and managed to keep those elites under control for until basically 2016. Whether there could have been another viable path that they could have successfully done, certainly in 2009, and Pablo has written about this, that in some sense that was a moment where there was a lost opportunity to really, it had 2/3 control over the legislature, and there was a possibility of really deepening the process of change. And instead of doing that, they made a decision. They no longer needed so much the social movements in the streets in order to protect them, in order to keep the government going and viable in face of the uprising in Santa Cruz. And so they slowly started to marginalize and co-opt and eventually divide those movements even more because they no longer actually needed them to the same extent. The question for me is whether or not there was another alternative in 2009 and 2010. I mean, politically there was, but would that have been viable given Bolivia's history? Would they have been able to pull that off? And I just have one comment about the new elites, the new bourgeois elites that have come up out of cooperative miners, contrabands, etc. I think it's really important to bear in mind that these new elites, that the Morales government has really responded to them, and they've had a lot of influence in the Morales government, but they're not the same as the old elites. They don't have accumulated wealth over centuries like the old elites in Bolivian society. And I think that they're very, you would call them nouveau riche if you like in another context. They really are, their wealth in some ways is quite tenuous. It's not based on, owning haciendas, et cetera, or mines over many, many centuries.
Well, we could certainly go on analyzing this period throughout the whole panel. Before I move to the next set of questions, I just want to see if there are any other final comments or reflections on this point before we move on from either Pablo or Linda.
No, I think that whoops, I don't know if I'm on. I think that we pretty much agree what the successes were and what the failures were, and in some places point where the actual point was that things went pear-shaped. From that where suddenly the agenda to keep the MAS in power, no matter what the cost of that was, became more important than the process of change.
Just one comment to what Linda said, that was it possible to do something different? I mean, and I think, yes, of course. We should have tried, and maybe we would have failed, because I cannot assure you, but at least trying to do something different and failing would have been much better than continuing to do what the government did and ending in this way, because we knew this was going to happen. I mean, the bourgeoisie in Santa Cruz, economically, as you have said, was happy, but until they would find a moment to take back power, and that's what was going to happen. We knew it. So we should have done a deep agrarian revolution. And we didn't. This is the lost opportunity of Bolivia, and it will take a long process to have that new opportunity.
Yeah.
I think that's a very sobering assessment about that particular moment in time, and whether or not it was the time to take a bit of a harder revolutionary perspective on how to confront change. But okay, well, we will shift space and time slightly now to move into the second round of the conversation, which is about the current interim government. And the question that will start us off, and Linda, we're going to have you start this time, is what is your perspective on this interim government and what it's done during its time in office? Do you think anything they've done is going to have any longer term impact? Or what's your sense of what's happened now? It's going on almost a year.
Oh, it's hard to believe it's been a year. Well, appointed by a group of anti-mass opposition figures to head a transition government until new elections could be held, Janine Áñez has done anything but. Last November, her government granted the military impunity the same day that she unleashed the military and the police on largely unarmed coca growers outside Cochabamba. 4 days later, they attacked again at the Sencata plant in El Alto, and between the two massacres, 20 unarmed people were killed. Her government continuously uses racist terms to describe indigenous peoples, denigrating indigenous cosmovision while announcing that the Bible has returned to the palace. Her government attacked the press, calling left-wing journalists seditious, and has permitted vigilantes to attack unarmed civilians, often using racist epithets. It has made moves towards privatizing publicly owned companies. It's fired almost all the ambassadors appointed by the MAS, as well as mid-level functionaries associated with the MAS. It has repeatedly accused Chapari coca growers of being drug traffickers and terrorists and threatened to send in the military. Dozens of Bolivians have been arrested, hundreds of foreigners have been expelled, and 7 top ex-MAS officials granted asylum by Mexico remain stuck in the Mexican embassy in La Paz. In January, Áñez announced she would be a candidate for the presidency, again violating her caretaker role, although she dropped out in September. The Áñez government has used the cover of the coronavirus to systematically persecute those affiliated with the MAS, and in an effort to undermine it as the country's strongest political force and to prevent it from winning the upcoming elections. The continuous postponement of those elections, while arguably making sense in public health terms, facilitated this repression. These actions stand in stark contrast to the last interim government that took control of Bolivia following the resignation of President Carlos Mesa 15 years ago. Unlike Áñez, when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Eduardo Rodríguez Velce, took over, he made it very clear that he had nothing on his agenda other than overseeing the election of a new president. He postponed every possible decision he could until the new elected administration took office. It remains to be seen what the longer-term impacts of the Áñez government will be. Even if specific policy initiatives don't endure, the empowering of the military and the police as kingmakers is a terrifying turn for the future of Bolivia's democracy. The Áñez government's acceptance and promotion of explicit racism has definitely halted the country's tentative steps in dealing with this historic legacy, and that may take years to recover from. The extreme polarization Áñez represents has divided the country into pro and anti-MAS camps, making any hopes for a peaceful transition after the October 18 elections slim, and raising questions about whether the MAS vote or the MAS will be allowed to assume office were it to win. Your turn.
Thank you, Linda. Pablo?
Yes. I think that the government of Janine Áñez was the worst government that we had, no? The difference is that the government of Janine Áñez is the government of the big agribusiness. Evo Morales was allied with the agribusiness. And now the agribusiness has its main figures in the government. And what they have tried to do is not wait to see what happens in the elections, but try to use this interim period in order to obtain some new concessions. One of the most important ones is the issue of GMOs, which Evo Morales started because he gave them in 2019, he approved a decree to authorize 2 new events of GMOs in soybean. And now this government has issued a new decree for hundreds of events in 5 different crops, no? Corn, sugarcane, cotton, and I don't remember the other one. Okay, so, and this is a problem because I think that now when you hear even MAS, when you hear MESA, they are not saying, okay, we're going to stop this and we're going to go back. So if you ask me what can last, maybe these concessions in relation to GMOs. Another thing that also started with Evo Morales, because there is a continuity between Evo Morales and Janine Áñez. This is something that people don't speak about it, but when it comes to agrofuels, through biofuel, ethanol, the government has also went in the same direction. And what we see coming from in the program of MESA and in the program of MAS is, yes, we're going to produce more biofuels. The main program, one of the main proposals of the government of Luis Arce, the candidate of MAS, is that we're going to make a lot of money with biofuels, which means we're going to deforest even more in order to produce more GMO soya and more sugarcane for these biofuels. So I am very, very worried and concerned about this. No? Now, in other terms, I think what they have done is because they have done cases of corruption. So there's a lot of people say, okay, then everything is the same. You just go to the government and you just try to grab as much money as you can. So this is very, very, very bad. And the government has done nothing to clarify the cases of these massacres that have happened at the beginning. And they have used justice, I must repeat again, in the same way that Evo Morales did, which is vengeance. Vengeance against those that are against me. And that Evo Morales did also. No? For example, there is a little bit of vengeance. There were some right-wing parliamentarians that also were put in an embassy for, I don't know if it was a couple of years or something like that, also during the government. And now this other sector does exactly the same with them. So it is, okay, we're going to use justice. We have the power. We will use justice to persecute those that are against us. And the biggest problem is that because they were campaigning for the elections, they didn't try to see, okay, how do we make an agreement between all of us to try to deal with the pandemic? So instead of trying to have a minimum agreement to have some concrete policies, No, the pandemic was used politically by one side and by the other side. And who has lost from this is people, because if you see the statistics, Bolivia is one of the countries that is in the top 5 of people dead per million people, per million of persons.
Thank you both. So clearly the raising up of the police and military, the reappearance of deep racism and the polarization are a set of issues that we're aware of. I want to ask about the question of Arce and the MAS sort of embracing GMOs and embracing biofuels, because we know that GMOs is not just a seed that's resistant to something. A GMO is a political economic structure. It brings with it a particular political economic structure that's sort of built into its DNA, so to speak. It seems really paradoxical given given what you've said before about the problem of the concessions to agro-industry. So is this kind of like Joe Biden saying, I'm not going to ban fracking just so as not to raise opposition? Or is there some deep commitment in the MAS to embrace agro-industry forever and GMOs?
No.
Well, my opinion is that we have inside MAS a big struggle. So I would say that in MAS you have different sectors. And now the good thing is that Evo Morales and his group doesn't control all social movements. And this has happened in the past 10 months. So now you have inside the social movements more freedom to speak and to say, I don't agree with this. So I think that the only way that we will find to stop this policies in favor of GMOs and biofuel and big mega dams is if social movements become more independent, began to speak with their own voice, and not under the logic of, hey, why do I say yes to biofuels? Because I don't want to lose votes in Santa Cruz. So you cannot have an electoral calculation. At this point, I think that, for example, MAS has 2/3 in the parliament. Now, they could have approved several laws in the past 10 months against the economic basis of the agribusiness. Some of the social organizations of MAS have presented projects of laws, but even though they have not approved, so what we call the leyes incendiarias, the laws that promotes forest fires, have not been annulled by the parliament. And we knew that this new ecocide was going to happen. Currently, we have more than 2.4 million hectares burned. Last year was even worse. It was almost 5 to 6 million hectares. But we could have stopped this if at least the parliament says, okay, we will annul these laws and we will not let this ecocide happen again. So I think the hope for me is not in the political parties. The hope is, are social movements going to be able to have an independent voice, self-organization, and if this happens, then we can find new ways to move forward.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think that the MAS has become totally dependent on that spigot of revenues, tax revenues from hydrocarbons, from agro-industry, and believes that the way to grow the country and to continue to reduce poverty is only through creating more income from extractive industry. My question, Pablo, is to what degree the social movements, as they become more independent from the MAS, which I definitely agree with you is a very positive sign, to what degree they will embrace an environmentalist or an environmentally friendly position. You know, that how deep that understanding is. I mean, historically, in my experience, the environmental consciousness among a lot of social movements is very local. So if my river, the river that I depend on, is really polluted, I really understand that very clearly. But something's going on in the other side of the country, especially in the eastern part of the country or up in the Amazonia, is not something that is really grasped very well, I don't think, by highland social movements, who very often see that land as empty and territory to be colonized. And so that would be my doubt about how far, or that's my question about how far those movements could go or will go.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a process. It's not simple. It's not straightforward. I like that you mentioned there are different sectors in the indigenous movement. You know? And for the indigenous people of the east side of the country, the lower part, of course, to defend the Amazons is vital. It's their territory.
Absolutely.
We must remember that in 25 years ago, that difference between the lowlands and the highlands began to be solved, and indigenous people of the highlands began to support very strongly the indigenous people of the lowland. Mm-hmm. But this was broken in I would say in the year 2011 with the Tipnis. For me, it was unacceptable to see repression against other parts of indigenous people. I think it can begin to, I mean, it's we can have a new reconfiguration, but I'm not sure. I see some signs. I see some, for example, in the lowlands, I see indigenous people that were under the control of the mass saying, okay, now I don't care if this was done by the previous government. I want to have the laws that promote forest fires to be annulled. Mm. And this would have not happened 1 year ago. I also see it in the highlands. For example, in the lithium project, I see the organization of indigenous people around the Salt Lake to begin to say, okay, we want to have all the information and we want to have our own proposals. And this is our new proposal. And this is very good. Now, is this going to succeed? We have to work for it because that is the only hope we have. I mean, I don't think there is another hope, no?
I think we're going to be circling back to these topics when we get to the audience question and answer period. So we'll just put the third round of questions on the table and then we'll turn to the audience. So given what you've both said about the legacies of the mass and the impact of the interim government, you've already sort of started to answer this question, and I think both of you agree that this will depend ultimately on the direction that social movements take. But the question is, in different policy areas, what direction should the next government go in, in an ideal world? And probably more importantly for this audience, and I'm seeing some questions roll in about what is the place for international, is there a place for international solidarity, and what should that look like? And we'll start, Pablo's turn to start this time.
Yes, I think we have to go now sector by sector and be very concrete, no? For example, I think when there was this idea of the government of Evo to be the energetic heart of South America and to export electricity based on big mega dams that were going to create, one of them, the third biggest lake in Bolivia, in the Amazon. So I think that, and now the situation of Bolivia, look, what is a little bit insane is that we have a capacity to produce electricity that is twice what we consume. But we don't have one single contract to export that electricity. So the government of mass invested in this kind of projects. We have a lot of surplus of electricity that we could produce and export. There is no contract, and suddenly the prices are going down. So what do we do with this overcapacity that we have, and how we use it for the benefit of Bolivians in a process of energy transition towards renewable energies? And in this case, I think that what we had in the previous government was everything controlled by the state. The next government can say, okay, we will begin to privatize the generation of electricity because it's not creating enough profit and so on. But you have also another option. We have to begin to promote that communities produce energy based on solar energy, mainly because we are one of the countries that has more sun in the world. And so that we generate new processes of income for communities, and not only that they wait and expect that the state gives them, but this means we have to overcome this logic of full statism, full state. I'm not saying go to privatization towards big multinationals taking over. That is the project of a sector of the right-wing forces, but it is, we need more commons in Bolivia, and commons in the sector of electricity are possible. And we can do it. A new government could do it, but it has to change totally the mindset.
Great points. Wenda, you want to stick on the topic of energy or take us somewhere else?
Well, I will be mentioning energy, I think. But first of all, I think that realistically, any new and hopefully progressive government in Bolivia will first have to work to reactivate the economy that has been severely damaged by the coronavirus. Bolivia's economy is predicted to contract by over 5% this year after 14 years of solid growth, although that did drop off in the last years of the Morales government as commodity prices dipped. A new government must continue to address ongoing poverty, a dependent economy, a weak and fractured educational and healthcare system, all within the context of protecting the environment, which is an enormous challenge given the historical dependence on extractivism. It also must prioritize indigenous working class and women's economic, social, and cultural rights, and strengthen the country's institutions, from the legislature and the judiciary to its political parties. This may all sound very utopian, especially for a society with the daunting challenges that Bolivia has. But I believe it's better to start with what you want and have to dial it back in negotiations than to lack vision. And I would say that losing sight of the vision is very much what happened to the MAS in the last years. Beyond the crisis created by COVID, in order to find a way to break the highest levels of economic informality in the world, which is what Bolivia has, and develop decent jobs for the population, I argue that rather than focusing on competing with its far more industrialized neighbors, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, greater consideration should be given to developing niche markets for what Bolivia does well and has ample resources in: sustainable tourism, renewable energy, solar, coffee, chocolate, quinoa, textiles, silver, sustainable forest products. All of these come to mind. I think the other economic focus must be on improving Bolivia's worker productivity, which is the lowest in the region, which means that even though wages are very low, Bolivian products have a hard time competing with their neighbors. So a continued emphasis on education and vocational training should be any government's priority. Extractivism will continue. After all, it's going to take more than 14 years to overcome this legacy of 500 years. But rather than expand uncontrolled, with economic considerations the only criteria for determining what projects should go ahead, new projects must have robust prior consultation systems in place, feasible value-added components to reduce the export of raw materials, and clear environmental remediation plans built in, certainly in mining particularly. Diversifying the tax base, I think, is also very important by strengthening personal income tax, something which would not be easy to do, but I see it as a way that's very key over the longer term in reducing the influence of extractivism over the government. I always think there's a role for international solidarity. After all, I've been involved with it for 30 years, including working with NACLA and as a founder of the Andean Information Network. Part of the challenge, I think, is to convey information that is easy for people who are not specialists to grasp, but not reduced to overly simplistic narratives. I think that Bolivia's current, or the coup in Bolivia last November, is a very good example of this. There's been a tendency on part of the left, particularly in the United States, to entirely blame it on US imperialism. I think this position robs Bolivians of their agency and downplays the likely interference, I think, of the Brazilians particularly. That's not to say that the United States was not involved, but I think that that position also glosses over the fact that much of what happened was driven by domestic power dynamics, very much including the failure of Evo and the MAS to find an adequate replacement leader, instead falling into the time-tested trap of caudillismo. This over-reliance on a charismatic, almost always male leader is a recurrent problem on the left, and one we have repeatedly failed to confront. In practical terms, I think that what people in other countries can do is pressure their own governments to support, respect for Bolivia's majority and its constitution. The constitution, which was written in 2009, was written by the most representative body the country has ever had. And so I think that that focus, and a focus on supporting social movements, which don't all agree at all and never will, and can be a very difficult group to deal with, certainly from a government perspective. But I agree with Pablo that the best hope for Bolivia at this point is in strong social movements. And I think that internationally, whatever people can do to support those social movements is really critical.
Thank you, Linda. A lot there. Before we dig into some of that, I'll let Pablo respond again. I don't know, Pablo, if you wanted to talk about other sectors or other policy areas, or take up the energy question again, or respond to something Linda said.
Yeah, no, yes, of course. I agree with Linda. The key thing is to reactivate the economy. The question is how to reactivate the economy. Because if we reactivate the economy with more extractivism, let's say we're going to expand the agribusiness and deforest 100 million hectares per year, that's catastrophic. You can reactivate the economy for some years, and then we're going to have a climate collapse, right, with droughts in different parts of the country. So I really think we cannot go that way. And we will have a very strong fight with whatever government will come from the elections, because they are going to try to see the easy way to reactivate the economy, which is, okay, let's have more oil extraction, let's have more deforestation, and whatever gives us money without looking at the medium term and long term. One thing is the agribusiness doesn't really pay taxes. Who pays taxes to the state is the oil sector controlled by the state. We should tax these sectors. It's the moment, if you want to reactivate the economy, you have to do what you didn't do before. No. And I think we have the possibility to promote, I agree, a Bolivia that exports ecological products and seeks to have incomes from tourism to this sector. One key aspect is what will happen with lithium, because we have the biggest reserve of the world of lithium, but we don't produce one single, well, we produce around 400 tons of lithium carbonate, but that's nothing.
Mm.
Are we going to be able to produce and to industrialize inside the country? If this happens, then you have a new opportunity. If you only produce lithium carbonate and you export it, it's the same cycle of extractivism. If you do it through the state, you have probably a little bit more revenue for you. If you do it through private companies, multinationals will take the biggest share. So this is key, and we're in the middle of a conflict with a company that Evo Morales signed a contract. It's a German company. It's a very small company. And they gave them a contract for 70 years to control and produce lithium carbonate in the Salt Lake. So for example, what Linda says, this issue of that there was a lithium coup, that's really, and I hear it very much in the US media, and that's nonsense. Because who really gave up, who, if you want to use the word privatizing, the lithium was the government of Mas. It was not the other way. And at the end, they had to in order to try to contain the social protest, to annul that decree. You know? Now we have a problem. What is going to happen with that German company that's very small, but that can demand us in international panels of arbitration for hundreds or even billions of dollars? We are going to need a lot of international solidarity to prevent this from happening. In the same way, we had your solidarity to prevent Bechtel, you know, trying to get a compensation of $100 million because they were kicked out of Cochabamba in the year 2000. So there is a lot of space for international solidarity, and I think it's mainly to support, of course, in these social movements, indigenous movements, but to have a, how can I say, we have to respect human rights of everybody. It doesn't matter if they are from the right or from the left. And this is a culture that we have to build in Bolivia. We cannot continue this confrontation that is in some cases insane. It's killing people, it's killing lives. And sometimes from the international solidarity, there is, oh, this is, we promote this. And this is, we have to find an agreement inside Bolivians. The next government has to seek some kind of agreement with the other forces in order to deal with COVID. And if we don't look at, and if we're going to politicize everything, I see a very dark future. In reality, my opinion is that the next government will last only 1 year, maybe 2. That's, if Mas wins, I don't think they will end their term. If Mesa wins, he will also not end his term. The economic situation is going to explode. We have a currency, a dollar, that is contained. It's the only country in South America that has not done any kind of devaluation of its currency. This is almost unsustainable. And this will trigger a deep economic crisis. We are already in a deep economic crisis. And if we don't try to find some kind of minimal agreement to try to lower the impact of the crisis that is already here and that will be deeper, we're going to go to a huge amount of violence and confrontation in Bolivia. And to say this is provoked only by the right-wing forces, come on. No, we have to be serious in order to address the difficult situation that we will face.
Well, it's very sobering, Pablo, and that is a prediction that I hadn't heard yet. There are several questions. We can transition into the audience questions. There are more than several. There are 40 or 50 questions here, so you'll have to forgive me, audience, for not being able to address all of the questions and trying to tie a few of them together. So, well, Pablo just left us with the question of the elections. We're going to circle back to the role of Brazil and to land and agro-industry and the right wing shortly. But since you just left us with the question of the elections, Pablo, there are several people asking about how you see the elections, including sort of an optimistic question about what would be a good outcome. But what you've just told us seems to suggest that there's not necessarily an easy answer to that question. So can you say a bit more about what you think about the elections, either Linda or Pablo?
Well, probably we will have a second round, no? So what we see is that MAS maybe will win in the first election, but they will not have enough votes in order to win the presidency. And then we will hope to go to a second election that's going to be in November. And then who will most likely win will be Mesa. And Mesa will be a government that has support from civil society, you would say in general, but doesn't have any concrete forces, doesn't have even a political party, no? So in reality, it will be a very weak government. Of course, MAS is more a political party with social movements that are regaining power. It's clear they are going to try to end as soon as possible the government of Evo Morales, of Carlos Mesa, in order to have new elections in 1-2 years. So that is their strategy. That is where we're going. No? And this will or can bring new processes of, I said, of confrontation, very deep ones. Do I think that there will be fraud in the coming elections? I don't think so. I think they will be much transparent than the previous elections of 2019, and that some of the deep the fraud that was created in the past election will not happen in this one. But I see that there will be less participation because of COVID and the pandemic. And there is certain uncertainty in the elections because until now, we all have seen all the polls and we have around 20% or more of the population that doesn't say for whom they are going to vote. So if a big part of that sector of the population votes for this side or for this side, they can change dramatically what is going to happen in the first round of the elections. So that is where we are now.
Yeah, I think that Pablo has laid it out pretty clearly. I think that the polarization between the pro-mass factions and the anti-mass factions, I mean, particularly the anti-mass factions are, so determined that the mass will not take over again. I mean, the mass has been painted as a terrorist organization. I mean, using a whole series of racist tropes in order to attempt to discredit them. I mean, drawing on deep sort of racist history in the country. So I think that unless something really gives, it's hard to imagine that this election, that anyone's going to accept the outcome of it. and whoever loses will not accept the outcome, which is effectively what happened in November 2019 as well. And there has been so much dispute about whether those elections were fraudulent or not fraudulent. I doubt that we will ever really know. But if this one maybe less, maybe who knows? It's impossible to know at this point what is going to happen. But I think it's not going to be an easy transition. Whatever it is, it's not going to be an easy one.
Well, I wish I could look into my crystal ball, but I can't. So we'll leave the elections there for a moment and shift back. A lot of people are really interested in the role of the right wing, and in particular, the connection between agro-industry in Bolivia and the role of Brazil. Can either of you say a little bit about how you see the role that Brazil played either in the past few years or in the November 2019 events or going forward?
Well, I think Brazil has increasingly over the last 2 decades become the regional power in South America, and it has expanded dramatically, especially into the countries around it. Paraguay being, which has gone on now for several generations, Peru, and Bolivia. And Brazil, much more than the United States, has very clear economic interests in Bolivia, particularly in soy. And they have, I just read an article, a very disturbing article in the Financial Times, in which they talked about Bolivia as kind of the last soy frontier in that whole soy region in that heart of South America, which includes Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and historically always to a lesser extent Bolivia, although Bolivia being a small country, it's had more impact. But they've talked about that there is a tremendous capacity to expand soy in that part of the world. The other thing that the Brazilians are also very involved in is gold and gold mining and the export of gold, a lot of it illegal, through Pando up into Arce, that's the region of Brazil. And increasingly, there are large numbers of Brazilians in Pando, in the far north, in the Amazon. So I think that Brazil, it's always been ironic to me when I talk to Bolivians and they talk about their fear of the Venezuelans. It's like, okay, but Brazil to me seems to be much more of a realistic and actual threat to this country's autonomy than Venezuela.
Yes, definitely. Brazil was directly involved in the coup d'etat in 1970. That was a real involvement.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the same for last year, no? Now, Brazil has, as Linda has said, strong presence through the agribusiness in the soybean sector and also in the cattle sector, the meat production. And I think that is the most biggest threat because I don't see that the soybean market is going to grow too much. Prices are low. But I see the big risk that we will have a growing demand when it comes to meat and the impact that this will have on forests and in indigenous territories. And yes, this is a big problem. And how to deal with it is a big issue because in reality, this big landowners, big capitals from Brazil are not very public. You don't see them, you don't see the media in Bolivia speaking about them, and they have a big influence. There are different studies that say that probably they control 1/3 of, or some say 40% of the soybean production. It's huge. But you don't see them as, oh, here we are. It's very subtle. So I think the only way to deal with this issue is if we are able to deepen in what we said we were going to do, this agrarian revolution. If we don't take back control of the land and we keep continuing, yes, we're going to have a huge problem in Bolivia. And also, I think linked to the other question of international solidarity, for example, this issue of GMOs, of glyphosate, and this all agrotoxics, we have companies that are trying to use Bolivia in order to promote them, like Bayer Monsanto. We can only stop them if we have an international solidarity campaign against these huge multinationals that you know them very well in the US, that are the ones leading and pushing and behind all this Bolivian agribusiness, because in reality, who's going to benefit from more GMOs and more agrotoxics in Bolivia are these big multinational companies.
Yes, definitely. I hope some of my students are out there listening about Bayer Monsanto. They're actually close by here, so we need to step up our activity in that direction. Well, staying on the topic of land and land reform, Linda mentioned several sort of ways of rethinking agrarian economies, ecological economies. And at several points, Pablo raised the issue of the lost opportunity of 2009 and 2010, when the MAS might have deepened the agrarian revolution. And several people are asking, what might that have looked like had the MAS taken a more, in my terms, revolutionary stance on land? What might that have looked like? What might have been able to happen? And of course, I guess this also has to do with thinking about the possibility of an agrarian revolution in the future. Either.
Yeah, go ahead, Pablo.
Yes, well, I think that we would have seen first, that we have a gradual reduction of GMOs, especially soybean GMOs. We would have seen, I mean, I'm not saying that we had to do something radical, go and confiscate all the land, no, but we had to implement the law, because we had a constitution that said, come on, you cannot have land that you don't use to produce. And if you don't show you're producing, then that land should go back to the state. That is our constitution in simple terms. You had to implement it. And implement it by looking at if those big landowners were really producing in that land, and they were respecting the rights of nature and so on. So we had to implement the law. Now, this was going to, of course, we would have resistance. Yes. But that is the way to move forward, because otherwise you have a very nice constitution, but then in reality you have something else. So the problem that we face is that we had a speech that was going in this direction and a practice that was going in this other direction from the side of the government. And for people living in Bolivia, well, this meant, well, you have a very nice speech against imperialists, but you're letting too much control to Chinese debt and companies here in Bolivia. I mean, you have the imperialist USA, but you cannot give, because of that, concessions to Chinese companies that have had contracts that were incredible. So you have to act with sovereignty. You cannot act only in terms of, hey, the enemy of my enemy is my ally. So China and Russia, and I will give Russia to build a nuclear plant in Bolivia. That was unbelievable. Why? We don't need it and so on, but because of political relations, you want to have good relations with Russia, because that can help you in your struggle against the US. And I really believe that you have to have a more sovereign policy, and this is key, and I hope we can advance in that, and not to see the world in terms of, the enemy of my enemy is my ally, because I think we will never overcome in that way colonialism and so on.
Yeah, I would add to that in terms of the land issue that I think maybe Pablo mentioned this before, but the land that was given out, that large sum of land that was provided to peasant farmers, largely in the eastern part of the country, was in fact already state land. There was almost no land that was expropriated. So, and in fact, the Constitution put a very clear limit, which was negotiated upwards on the amount of land that any one individual could hold. But the elites in Santa Cruz managed to negotiate that it couldn't be applied retroactively. And they managed, as people do with laws, right? They found ways to get around it so that everybody in a family had 5,000 hectares, so that altogether you had, 50,000 hectares and you were really just one family. So there were a number of ways in which the really deep agrarian reform, which is a huge challenge and has been a challenge for Latin America now, really since independence from Spain. It has been these consolidated land holdings that they inherited from the hacienda system, and also in Bolivia's case from particularly the Banzer dictatorship in the 1970s, when huge tracts of land in the eastern part of the country were given out to Banzer's cronies. I agree that if the MAS could have done a more substantial agrarian reform, it would have really changed a lot of the dynamics in the eastern part of the country. Now, would it have meant that those small farmers with their 50 hectares would not have been growing GMO soy? I'm not so sure, but it would have gone a long way to break up the power of the agro industry or the agro-business elites, I think.
Well, I'll ask a follow-up there, especially because Pablo was in the government, and this is my shameless self-promotion. I just finished a book on Bolivia in the age of gas, but one of the questions I didn't answer in my dealing with land reform was whether the MAS, Pablo, you said all you had to do was implement the law. The law was there. But to implement the law would have generated resistance, and that would have led the government to have to call on the police or the military for support. In some cases, they were able to call on social movements to be sort of the bodies in the streets in Pando or in the Chaco. But implementing the law would have meant, I think, or this is a question, would have meant calling on the police or the military. And was it the case that the MAS never had complete control or ability to call out the police and the military, and might that have contributed to their backing off from the agrarian revolution?
Well, this is a huge issue, because I think we said we were going to decolonize the armed forces. So we wanted to have a different kind of armed forces. But in reality, when, for example, there was a movement in Bolivia from the sergeants in the year 2012-13 to do this, the government of Evo Morales defended the hierarchy of the armed forces, defended this structure that we had and we have until now. So the military were a privileged sector during the government of Evo Morales, very privileged. To give you one example, when I retire, I only receive 30% of my salary. The only sector in Bolivia that receives 100% of your salary is the military. There is no other sector. And that was a huge concession given by the government. In ambassadors, for example, out of around 24, 25 ambassadors, 6 ambassadors were from the military, because it was the way to give the military, you know, their quota, their share. So I think what was the change in the military? That they made them say, patria o muerte venceremos. And to cry that patria o muerte venceremos is not a change, excuse me. It's to have the illusion that you're changing something, and you're not changing. And so yes, I think one of the deepest problems is how do you deal with military and the police when you have a process of change. And we didn't do it, and that is why we have what we had, no? I would say that the top military were very much in favor, especially in 2019. No? We had the chief commandment of the military supporting very openly Evo Morales. So I think that if you want to look at a process of change, of course, you cannot only focus on agrarian reform without looking at how you're going to deal with the process of change in the military, in the structures of power, in the judicial system. This is the other big problem. We have to have a judicial system that is independent, so that the judicial system can also bring me to jail. I cannot build a judicial system that only brings to jail those that are against me. I mean, and this is key. And what has happened in Bolivia and in other parts of the world with the left is they want to control everything. And you have to have an independent judicial system if you want to apply the law, because the law has to apply for everyone. If they are, you say no GMOs, it means no GMOs for the small farmer and for the big landowner. No? So I think it's difficult to only focus on one sector without looking at the entire global perspective, and also the economy. I think the biggest lost opportunity was to transform our economy, because we had a lot of income from gas exports, but we didn't diversify the economic production in Bolivia. Now we don't have the money, and it's more difficult to think of economic diversification. But we had that money, especially until the year 2015. And we lost that opportunity. All the new economic sectors that develop mass really do not work. So they don't produce really more revenues, and they haven't really diversified the economy. So I would only say, let's look at the whole in all its parts to see how a process of change can advance.
I'm sure we'll come back to the question of the police and the military. I want to shift gears just slightly to address a question that just came in about the feminist movement and the question of gender and sexuality politics. We've seen the rise of religious conservatives as part of the transition government, and a particular discourse on gender and sexuality. Would either of you comment on how you see the role of the feminist movement in the coming period, including demands for abortion rights and gay marriage? You're muted, Linda.
I think that the women's movement in Bolivia has had very contradictory kinds of successes. You've got a country where you have almost close to legislative parity in the legislature and in municipal councils, etc. But you also have one of the highest rates of femicide and domestic abuse against women in the hemisphere. So you have both of those two realities existing side by side. I think that the feminist movement per se has largely invested a lot of resources, I think, in getting legislative parity, because that was really something that was achievable, whereas dealing with violence against women really requires changing the culture, and changing. So it's much more difficult to address. I think that the resurgence, the whole abortion issue, I mean, Bolivia came very close actually to passing a legislation that would have expanded abortion rights. But the churches, the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant evangelical churches have always stood very, very firmly against it. And they just did not have the power to push it through. I think that the women's movement going forward, I think it's a lot is one step forward, two steps back, or maybe hopefully two steps forward, one step back. But it's a slow process, because I think that expanding women's rights, you can expand women's rights, you can expand workers' rights in the law, but if they're not respected in practice, you have very limited enforcement mechanisms in a country like Bolivia. So you can have a very nice constitution, as Pablo says, with a lot of protections for people, but if you have no enforcement capacity, the outcomes are limited. And I think that that's very true for the situation for women. Do you want to add, Pablo?
I agree totally. I would just add that I think that the problem is that it's not only, we don't not only need a change in the law, we need a change in the culture. And it's very important what the government does, what persons do in the private life.
Right.
If you want to have a cultural change, those that are in the government have to give this example of this change. And this has been the biggest contradiction inside the government of Evo Morales, because you had so huge machist jokes in relation to women. And everybody knew that this issue that has come out, you can say it's a personal issue. I don't think it's a personal issue. That there are accusations against Evo Morales that he was with a very young woman. And this was something known, that they were minors, and you cannot allow that. You should have brought that. And that means to confront your main leader.
Mm.
And the feminist movement inside MAS just closed their eyes and didn't want to look at that. And there was a feminist movement outside of MAS that pointed out, and I really think they were absolutely right, because you cannot have this mixed thing between practice and what you do in legal terms, in terms of legislation. That has harmed us a lot. But I see that this here, maybe we will have some more progress. I see also now coming out in different social sectors, hey, we have to address this issue, and also address it not only in law, but in our private and daily life.
Linda, any thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
no, I hope you're right, Pablo. Not just in Bolivia, but everywhere else too.
Yes, I hope to.
So there seem to have been a number of sort of political compromises and political calculations that kind of eroded firm ideological commitments from at least 2009 going forward, not the least of which was a commitment to transforming questions of gendered violence, inequality, and sexual rights and freedoms. This is going to be bouncing around a little bit, but if you could see the list of questions I'm looking at, you'd be bouncing around too. So bear with us as we move from theme to theme. Another question that's been raised here, the speakers made a number of valid and insightful criticisms of the MAS and the MAS-aligned movements, but I'd love to hear about the social movements that were critical of the MAS during its time in government and their trajectory. I'm thinking in particular about non-MAS aligned movements such as CONAMAC and CIDOB that played big roles in the Tipnis dispute, but now, at least in the case of the former CONAMAC leader, Rafael Quispe, have joined the Áñez government. Can either of you help us make sense of what's going on there?
I can't. So it's up to you, Pablo. That one I can't figure out.
Well, I think that what happened is that, for example, CIDOB. CIDOB is the indigenous organization of the lowlands. They were very much involved in the case of Tipnis, but after the march, the government began to divide the organization. And they divided the organization. And they control one part of the organization. And the other part, some of the leaders went to right-wing forces as a way to resist the persecution from the government. I don't agree with that at all. I'm just saying that dynamic, and you have then leaders that were critic to Evo at the beginning that ended with right-wing forces. Yes, you have that, and you have several. And you have had that, and this is a process because I think we have to accept that there is diversity, and diversity means not all social sectors, social movements can agree with the government. And it's very good that they don't agree, because that's the only way you are going to be able, as a government, to correct when you have wrong positions. The problem is when you try to control them, what happens with some of the leaders of those social movements? They will embrace right-wing positions.
Right.
Today, I would say it's a pity because we don't have what you would say an alternative left, and we could have it. But it has been so divided and persecuted, those that try to create something in the left, but not in mass, that it doesn't exist. So, and now you are in this situation. And I think that in that sense, we need to promote a real democracy. A real democracy means the left has to accept that there are other lefts. There isn't one left. When you begin to say the left, I begin to be a little bit scared, you know? So, and I think that is what MAS did. And that is why we have these things that some leaders have ended with right-wing forces, which is very bad and reinforces right-wing perspectives, right-wing visions. No?
I think that one of the reasons that the MAS operated in the way that it did, I think probably comes out of the history of the COB, where there would be a lot of political dissension within the COB, but the face that it presented to the world was unified, right? And so that you kept the political disagreements and political struggles in-house. And I think that the MAS coming out and as part of that legacy, very much adopted that style of trying to keep everything in-house. And as you said, you were either in the tent or you were really out of the tent. And so if you were out of the tent, you're really your only choice to have any kind of backing was to go to the right wing. I mean, I spoke to people, I've spoken and interviewed people in CONAMAC Orgánico and CIDOB Orgánico, and they were in desperate situations, both economically and politically. They were not able to really mount they had their political positions, but they were starving. I mean, it was a really, really difficult situation. And so it's understandable that certainly some number of them would end up on the right.
I would just add that I don't agree with the COP because I have lived the period of the COP. The COP is the main trade union where everybody's there. No, we had when we had debates, you had the Communist Party, you had the Trotskyists, you had the anarchists, and you could speak. I remember the debates in the political commission that were open to the media, to the press. So there were internal debates, very strong. And then at the end, a decision will be taken. And of course, the COP, the huge social organization will say, okay, we will do this. But social dissent was always there. Well, inside MAS, you couldn't have that dissent even inside. I mean, it's not that inside MAS there was a big debate in their meetings of different tendencies and so on. No, and that debate didn't exist, not for the outside, not for the inside. The only ones that really had that debate were the small circle that was around Evo Morales, and everything was, hey, how do I get more the support from Evo Morales? How do I convince him? And not how do I convince the political movement in order that Evo Morales does what the political movement wants to do. No, it's how do I get in the head of Evo Morales, in his mind, by, I don't know, different tactics. So I think democracy is key inside social organizations. I would defend democracy in the COP. I would say that at the beginning, MAS was like that, social movements were like that, but this ended, I would say, in 2012, 13, when there was this message sent by Álvaro García Linera: no libre pensantes, no free thinkers in MAS.
Right, because I definitely heard about internal debates going on in different ministries, but maybe not much past about 2013 or 14.
Yeah.
This is great because it kind of feeds into a line of questions that people are asking about whether or not an Arce government can be different. We've seen in the past week or so that David Choquehuanca was actually raising some slightly self-critical questions about the MAS, the cabinet, and a couple of people are asking about whether or not the Choquehuanca candidacy represents the return of a more indigenous cosmovision to the MAS project. A couple of questions about whether or not Arce will simply replicate Evo, or will we see a loosening up of what you're both commenting on, this very kind of hermetically sealed decision-making circle? And I know that's a hard question to answer, but any perspectives are welcome.
Well, I think that's already happened to a certain extent. I mean, power became so increasingly concentrated in the hands of Evo Morales and the circle around him. Arce too was part of that circle because the economic piece was so important. But I think that just the fact that Evo is not in the country and that Evo is not in charge of the MAS directly means, or hopefully means, that there is more space for internal debate. And certainly the presence of Choquehuanca on the ticket as the vice president, I think also reflects a different perspective than that of Evo Morales. Now, what would happen if the MAS won and Evo returned to Bolivia? I don't know. But I think the fact that he's not in the country and he's not running and he's not able to run as senator is very positive for the MAS. And the hope is that they will really take advantage of this to reinvent themselves?
I would say that who had to be the president candidate was David Choquehuanca. He was the one elected by the social movements, the social organizations in Bolivia. It was Evo Morales from Argentina who said no to David Choquehuanca and imposed Luis Arce. And there was a big debate for the first time, a very open debate inside social organizations. And they finally said, okay, if we stick with David Choquehuanca for the presidency, we're going to divide because Evo Morales definitely doesn't want him. So they accepted, but they said, okay, this is the last time. Huh? And they have repeated this several times. And we will elect the candidates for the parliament, not you from Argentina. So there is this tension happening. Now, does this mean that Luis Arce is just some kind of puppet of Evo Morales? No. So you have another wild card there that, yes, I mean, if he wins and he is president, Evo Morales will try to control him, for sure, no? Now, will he let himself control? Will the different social leaders accept that situation? And there is one thing that we call, watch out, that once you're president, you can give some things to leaders of social movements. You can give them ministries, you can give them high positions and so on. And we can see a new start of a process of cooptation of leaders of social organizations. That danger exists. You can, and you will also see resistance from different sectors saying, no, we don't want that. But this is something that we really don't know, and this is key. Because if you have a government that is from us that would be more open to the discussion inside, to hear what is happening, things would evolve in a different direction. But there's going to be a lot of tension inside MAS if they win the election, for sure. No, of course, the most of the analysts that are linked not only to right-wing forces, some are independent. The mistake that they make is they see MAS as a one party that under Evo, and it's all the same, and it's not really. Now it has, yes, of course, Evo is a very important factor, but now you have many others that we have spoken about.
We have several, again, I apologize to the audience. I'm doing my best here. Several people are a little bit disappointed, maybe disappointed is not the right word, but a little bit concerned that a lot of the blame here is getting laid on the left, when in fact the right was not sleeping, and in the lead up to the events of November, it's probably not the case that we can put all of the blame on Evo and the left. Can either of you comment on the role of the non-MAS sectors who participated in those events, and whether or not that means that it wasn't all Evo's fault?
I don't think either Pablo or I are saying that it's all Evo's fault or the MAS's fault. I mean, they made a series of errors that and they developed a dependency on Evo Morales's leadership that was really unhealthy and contributed to the situation that happened. But they nor anyone else could really have ever predicted. I mean, before the election, it was moving along that Carlos Mesa was the chief opponent, and who is very much a centrist candidate and has been president before, and at least expresses that he has a real commitment to the rule of law, etc. the sort of hijacking of that process of the protests against Evo and his illegitimate running in that election by the far right was not, I think, anything that very many people could have predicted. And I think it probably even took some people on the right by surprise. I mean, I certainly don't or never found any evidence that there was some sort of long-standing conspiracy. It was just that when Camacho appeared with all of his antics, the right wing started jumping on board as this was a mechanism to get rid of Evo Morales.
I would say that, yeah, of course, in a way you can say the right-wing forces and the North American imperialism is always conspiring. What does this mean? It's always trying to take advantage of any kind of opportunity in order to regain some kind of power, some kind of privilege. That for sure has happened during the past decades and centuries. It is like that. But the opportunities, who serves them the case, they would have not been able to build this if, for example, Evo Morales would have said, okay, I respect the referendum and we will elect a new candidate. For sure, they would have won the elections of 2019. For sure. So in that sense is that I say you give the right-wing forces the opportunity to reorganize and come because you pursue something that you shouldn't, that was not on our constitution. You say that there is a human right to the permanent re-election, which is really crazy. And that the right-wing forces and in North American imperialists will, of course, if you have the opportunity, you will take it. Now, were they preparing everything and they really expected the outcome that happened? I don't think so. They were also surprised from how fast things evolve. No? If you would have asked me 5 days before the resignation of Evo Morales, is this a possibility? I would have said, no way. No. So I would say it took us all by surprise. And of course, who was more prepared to capitalize the situation? Right-wing forces. Why? Because left-wing forces were disseminated. So that possibility didn't exist. If you would have had another left movement, maybe that could have happened. Huh? But because under the government, that was not possible under the government of Evo Morales, the only other alternative was going to come from right-wing forces. I think that was almost inevitable. I'm not saying that was okay, not at all, but that was something that was going to happen.
Very insightful. There are a bunch of, as you both know, ongoing debate about whether or not it was a coup and whether or not that was fraud, which I'm going to use my role as a moderator to leave for another moment. But at any rate, I think we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm trying to pick out something to kind of bring us home. But do either of you have any points or issues that you think we should address before taking the last couple of questions? Something that we may not have touched on that you think we should. If not, I'll come up with another one. I have several here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I have one here about Santa Cruz, going back to the Camba, quote, quote, Camba, the regional label that Cruceños have taken for themselves, and the Camba bourgeoisie. Who do they want in office?
The Camba bourgeoisie the government of the Kamba bourgeoisie would have been the government of Janine Áñez. I mean, Janine is very much unknown, but Ortiz, Marinkovic, who are ministers, are the most important persons representative of this, and they are really the minds of the Kamba bourgeoisie. I would say Camacho, of course, he's the wild young guy, but he's not the mind of the Kamba bourgeoisie. I mean, he's not very clever, no, but he has guts, of course. They would have wanted that, but they lost that opportunity. They will have to accept a government of Carlos Mesa, and they want to negotiate with him. And because they want to negotiate with him, they are sticking to Camacho, because they know that Camacho, of course, doesn't have any chance, but he will have probably, I don't know, 5% of parliamentarians. That can be very key in order to make an alliance with Carlos Mesa. Carlos Mesa will need the votes of this very small group of parliamentarians of Camacho. And they are going to use this in order to push Mesa more and more to their side, you know? So I think that is why there is a difference, you know. I would say the bourgeoisie of other parts of the country say, okay, we have to all step down and support Mesa to win in the first round. But that's not the thought of one very important part of the bourgeoisie in Santa Cruz that says, if we do that, yes, Mesa will win the elections, but what's going to be our negotiating power?
Linda, I don't know if you want to add anything
No,
to that.
I think that's a very interesting analysis and very interesting take on the role of Camacho and the bourgeoisie. What I think is very interesting about the right wing or the bourgeoisie in Santa Cruz is the way in which they've recoalesced really pretty quickly after really being divided. The economic elites basically supporting Evo Morales because they were doing so well with the expansion of soy agriculture, and how quickly they have now recoalesced around a right-wing candidate. At some point, they really divided between the civic committee, the very conservative civic committee, and the economic elites. And now they've recoalesced, they've come back together, and I guess they're using Camacho, or think to use Camacho as their trump card.
No pun intended.
No pun intended.
So I think that also explains why Tuto's staying in the race, even though he's polling about 2%, is to hope to at least have a foot in the game going forward. Well, we won't end with more commentary on that. We'll end with the big question that I think both of you have addressed, but actually, and I have another last question coming in about the way the OAS handled all of this. That's another Pandora's box. So let's take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about the OAS, and then I'll ask the last question.
Okay, well, the OAS played a very questionable role in the November elections, and unfortunately, they are going to be the principal election observer in this coming election. I just read today that the European Union is not planning on sending very many observers, and I would say that of the people who were observers in the November 2019 election, the EU was the most neutral player in the game. The OAS first, Almagro, who was the head of the OAS, told Evo Morales that in May 2019, that he could run. And then the night of the elections, the OAS was without really any substantial evidence claiming fraud. So, and subsequent analysis of the OAS from a variety of people who have no invested interest in the outcome of the election have really called the OAS findings into question. So it's very questionable what they did, and it raises questions about what their political motivation was in those elections.
I would say that why did the OAS come to Bolivia? Because Evo wanted. And he invited them.
Well, they go to every election.
No, but not only that they go to every election, Evo Morales invited Almagro before. He did a huge event with him in Chapare. He gave a lot of protagonism to OAS during the first days after the elections. He did an agreement after that with OAS so that they will do this kind of audit.
Right.
He could easily have said, no, I will not do it. No, so that's one point, that it's one part of the fact. The second thing is, I have read some of the reports in relation to that there was no fraud, but there are some facts and hard facts. One hard fact is, did they stop the counting, the fast counting of votes the night of the election? Yes. In order to cut the counting of the votes, they cut the light? Yes. Is it true that there was a server that was illegal, that was receiving the data coming from the different centers of vote before going into the electoral court? Yes. Is it true that there were, how do you say, actas that were manipulated? You know, the forms where you register the votes. Do they exist in reality? Yes, they exist. Today, they said that now they have finished and they have found 8,000 out of 34,000. Have I seen them? Yes. I cannot say that the 8,000 is true or the 300 is true, but that this happened? Yes, it happened. Is it true that there were some in the electoral court? So for example, in the case of Bolivia, if you have in one of the schools where you go to vote, there is a problem, you have to repeat the election. And according to what the electoral court said in the first days, they had to repeat at least the elections in 4 different places. But suddenly, in order to give the victory to Evo Morales, all of these cases disappeared. And you had to repeat them. So what I'm trying to say is that there are facts. So when I say, hey, there was fraud, there was fraud. I mean, to be exact, you would say, can you legitimize what happened in Bolivia? No. And you have to look at that. And there is a two discourse. I mean, if you come to Bolivia, most of the people will tell you, yes, there was some kind of fraud. But if you go to Argentina or to the US, especially in the left, it's no, everything is an invention, nothing happened. And no, they are concrete facts. Now, the day that Evo Morales resigned, the OAS came with its report. Let's say the report was very bad and you really didn't cheat. Why did Evo Morales accept that report? He dismissed the electoral tribunal before resigning in the morning of that day. Why is it that the entire electoral tribunal now is in court? Because Evo Morales said, you have to, we dismiss you. And you don't dismiss people that have done a good job. I mean, it doesn't matter who if I'm sure that this team did nothing wrong, why should I dismiss them and send them to what has happened, a very big trial that is still going on this issue. And the other thing, you have a law. Why is it that the parliament of Bolivia, where Evo Morales has 2/3, approve a law that says there has to be a new election and the past election doesn't count? If you are 100% sure that you didn't do nothing wrong, why do you, if you have the 2/3 to say it, agree to say, okay, this doesn't count. Second, Evo Morales cannot run in the coming elections, because this was a decision in the parliament. And you can say, okay, but these are only politicians in the parliament. But there was a meeting with social movements of 6 hours that was live streamed by TV. And the leaders of the different social movements agree on this way out. So it's more, the situation is much more complex that this discourse that, oh, you know, there is a bad guy who created everything, is Oas with its report, and everything was okay. No, it's not true.
Thank you for sharing that, Pablo, and I'm sure that the arguments will continue, given that a lot of people don't have a lot of faith in the OAS either. So we're caught.
I don't have faith either. Huh?
It's in this situation. So before we sort of give you both 30 seconds to answer the toughest question, I just want to say thank you again to both of you. Thank you to the organizers, and especially thank you to the audience. And I should tell Pablo and Linda that several people in the audience are also saying thank you. So it is not a hostile audience. At the risk of asking a question that's unanswerable, you know, in 30 seconds, what do you see as the key lessons learned here? And I guess we'll give Pablo a break for 1 second and let Linda start.
I'll try. Well, I think replace your leadership. Keep your leadership fluid. Insist on internal democracy. Respect and listen to the movements that put you into power. And really foster a climate of debate and discussion on the issues within your movement. And I understand that when you're under attack from the right, that is not always such an easy thing to do. But I think that the process is as important as the outcome. And that if you sacrifice the process to the outcome, at the end of the day, you will always lose. You'll always come up short.
I agree with Linda. I would say even more. I mean, anyone that goes into power, and I have been part of the government of Evo Morales, once you go into the government, you're captured by the logic of power. It's, from my point of view, it's inevitable. It doesn't matter how wonderful leader, revolutionary you are, you will be captured by this logic of power. And the only way to have a counterforce to this is you have to have social movements that are autonomous, independent, that can criticize you. You have to build your own counterpower to yourself, because you're going to be eaten by power. And of course, you don't have to stay in power a very long time. You have to step down. There has to be new leaders coming on. And it's not only a problem of surveillance of social movement. You have to decentralize power and give more power to social movements. Instead of trying to concentrate all the power on the state, you have to see ways that, for example, when we were speaking about the issue of electricity, how this is not only controlled by a state-owned company of electricity, but it's also decentralized, and you have some kind of experiences of the commons to produce electricity, so that more and more social organizations have real power, not only the power to control you, but real power in real life.
Thank you. I think those are both excellent conclusions. And I'd like to thank you again and also remind everyone that this is being recorded and will be available. So stay tuned to NACLA and or NYU CLACS for information about how to see the recording. And once again, thank you to the audience for the great questions. And I apologize for not being able to have addressed all of them. I hope everyone takes care, and let's hope that Pablo and Linda are right and that we'll maintain our faith in the social movements of Bolivia going forward. Thank you both very much. Good night.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Igualmente, igualmente. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.